All right, this week on the Context blog, we're talking with CJ Pascoe about her new book titled Nice is Not Enough, Inequality and the Limits of Kindness at American High. CJ is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Oregon, and she has been studying young people in school pretty much since she herself was a young person in school. Her first book, titled Dude, You're a Fag, examined homophobic harassment, heterosexism, and masculinity in a very different high school context, which we'll talk about a little bit today. So CJ, welcome to the Context blog.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. This is really fun.
All right, let's jump right in. So CJ, you describe American High as a school characterized by kindness, a school that students have described to you as full of violently accepting people. And so to begin, why don't you introduce our audience to this very special high school and tell us a little bit about how you ended up there in the first place?
Yeah. So I ended up there on accident, right? As I think many of the best ethnographies do, we end up in places on accident. I know, and I remember when I was writing Dude, and I would get asked this question, well, how did you choose this school? And I would always feel sort of deeply insecure because I'd be like, I don't know, the school chose me at a certain point, right? Which is what has happened almost with every school I've studied, including American High. You have some ideas about what it is you want to do, but really you have to end up sort of working your networks to get in somewhere and have somebody let you in. And so I got into American High on accident. I happened to know people who knew people who knew people who knew people who were like, oh yeah, I think they'd be happy to have you, right? Which is different than how I got into River High with Dude, which is I sent principals letters and I was like, can I come study your school? And finally one principal relented. And so I think the beauty of ethnography is that you can end up someplace and learn something no matter what, right? And that's my general approach, is once I get into a school, I'm like, well, what is it that I'm going to learn here? What's interesting about this place? What can we learn about it? Is it different or similar to other places, right? What can it tell us about how the world works right now? And that's always sort of my mindset, right? And so when I walked into American, I knew it was going to be different from the second I walked in, because there were these signs everywhere. It was like, there's no room for hate. If I see racism, I'm going to do this. If I see sexism, I'm going to do this. You look beautiful today. Empowered women support women, right? It was just sort of everywhere. And it wasn't just the signs. The teachers talk like this, the students talk like this, graduates talk like this, the parents talk like this, and so it was really a special place that people loved and wanted to come back to. The principal had to tell students that they couldn't come back and hang out after graduation, right? So it was a really special, warm, and welcoming place that I fell into.
Yeah. Very cool. Tell us, when you initially walked in, did you have specific questions that you thought you might answer?
So I did, and this is also sort of an ethnographic moment. My original book was supposed to be about teenage practices of love and romance, right? So when I wrote Dude, I wrote a lot, as you mentioned, about heterosexist harassment and how heterosexist harassment passes as flirting and romance in adolescence. And I felt really unsatisfied with leaving it where I had left it in Dude, which is that boys understand themselves and others to be masculine, in part through exercising dominance over girls. And oftentimes this is dominance that's coded as romance. And I wanted to know more about what was happening among teenagers, and the way they thought about their dating and romance practices, and how this had maybe changed with sort of the increased use of social media and phones and all these things. And so I went into the school with a set of questions about dating and romance and courtship practices. But I got into the school soon after Trump was elected. And so I found myself in this place that was characterized by kindness and respect and acceptance, wanting to ask these questions about love and romance, when really what was happening in that school was that they were fighting the same battles that were being fought throughout the rest of the country at that point, which is that we have a leader who is sort of ensuring or giving a national platform to racism, sexism, nationalism, homophobia, violence. And so all of that was playing out in the school culture. And so my questions about love and romance weren't landing, right?
Mhm.
And so I had to do what ethnographers often have to do, which is I had to pivot. I had to follow what everybody else was interested in, right? And so what I retained was my interest in inequality, right? What I was really interested in was inequality and how that was sort of reproduced or challenged. And I was happy, I happened to be thinking about that in the case of love and romance. And so I sort of pulled back on that case, although I do end up writing about it, pulled back on that case and sort of followed the other examples that were sort of more relevant at that time about inequality, if that makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. I'd love to hear more about how you've been thinking about the differences between the two high schools that you visited. I'm thinking there's temporal differences, differences in the political climate outside the school, but also just maybe idiosyncratic differences in the school itself and the leaders and the organizational structure. So tell us more about how you've been thinking about those things.
Yeah, so when I researched Dude, right, I was in a school that felt a lot like schools looked in the movies. It felt a lot like my own high school, right? Where it was like the kids against the grown-ups. It was a super adversarial relationship. We were always trying to put one over on the adults. The adults were like the adults in like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? Sort of droning on and not in touch with students at all. And that's simply not what I saw at American High, right? I saw teachers who were deeply concerned about students, who wanted to make sure that they were honoring students' gender identities. They wanted to make sure students had food, and so use their own money to make sure that they were well fed. They would sort of go out of their way to make sure their identities were reflected in the classroom, and addressed in course content. And you know, one student described a Miss Bay, who was a beloved teacher, that he said she has a weird non-psychotic love for you guys, right? And I feel like that just really captured the way the staff felt about students at this particular school, which is in part unique to American, but I think it does reflect a sort of larger shift in education and adolescence in general, right? Which is that it's sort of shifted to be a less adversarial place, and our schools have made, not all schools, some schools have shifted to be less adversarial places and more places that where we want to meet students' needs, right? And I think we really saw that get hammered home in the pandemic, right? That we saw that schools are really a social service agency in many ways. It's where students get fed, it's where students can get healthcare, it's where students can get clothes, right? It's where they can experience state benefits in a way they can't experience them in other places. And so I don't think this was fully unique to American High. I think it represents a shift. And part of the shift I think it represents is that we have more discussions about inequality now than we did when I was researching Dude, right? We have state laws that protect young people around gender and sexuality. We have GSAs in every state in the country. We didn't have that when I was studying Dude. And we have a larger language around racism and sexual harassment than we did in the early 2000s. And I think some of this is due to social media, right? That young people have access to information they didn't have before. And I think that's radically changed some of the discussions we're seeing in schools. But I don't think, and this is what the book ends up being about, right? Is that in many ways, the way schools are responding to the problems that students are highlighting of racism and homophobia and sexism, is with an anti-bullying language. Because what we saw happen in the early 2000s is schools sort of were part of this national panic we had about cyberbullying, right? We see this like peak in the early 2000s around concerns about bullying. And it's not that bullying rates went up, right? It's that kids got cell phones and all of a sudden adults were really concerned with what they were doing. And so then we had this sort of national discussion about bullying that you really see sort of take off about 2010. And the solution to bullying is to be kind, right? That's what all the kids are taught now. Don't be mean, be kind, and that will solve all the problems. And so we have this then mismatch between what the kids are highlighting as problems, which is racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and what the school sees as a solution, which is love each other, right? So
Yeah. Why don't you tell us more about what you see as the limitations of that approach? What's not enough about being nice?
about being nice, right? Right. It's sort of a provocative statement. When you come out against kindness, it's maybe not the most popular lead in,
It sells.
but here we are. Yeah, right. So I think what I was struck by was, I talked to you about how I saw all those posters when I walked into the school, right? And then I get these reports from everybody about what an accepting place it is. And I remembered at one point I called a friend and I said, I think I'm going to write a happy book. I'm going to write a book about how people love each other. This is so great, right? And then I started to watch some things happen, and something really crystallized the moment of the day the senior assembly happened. And so the senior assembly happens at a lot of schools, right? It's the last assembly for the seniors, their senior year, and the teachers do like a special dance for them. And at the end, the seniors all run through a tunnel made of the teachers' arms and they're all cheering, right? So it's this really big, exciting day. And I walked into the assembly and I'm standing on the sort of side of this giant gym, which is where most of the staff and teachers stand, right? The students are all in bleachers and we're sort of on the side. And the assembly opens with the national anthem, right? The show choir sings the national anthem. And as the show choir is singing, I watch out of the corner of my eye and I see a sort of rustling among the staff members I'm standing next to. And I watch as the teacher drops to one knee. And I'd never seen this happen before, right? And so this one teacher is engaging in the protest that had sort of been started and popularized by Colin Kaepernick to protest racist police violence, right? And so he drops to one knee, and I watch as several other teachers drop to one knee in this protest, and no students copied them. Nobody even seemed to acknowledge them. The rest of the teachers were kind of staring straight ahead. And when the song ended, they all stood. And so I watched that happen. And then I watched what happened in the weeks that followed, which seemed to contradict the events that happened in the weeks that followed seemed to contradict these messages of love and kindness that were throughout the school. People were incredibly upset that the teachers had done this. People called it political, and the school district ended up writing letters to each of these teachers saying that kneeling to protest racist police violence was considered a political act. And if they continued to engage in political activities, they would lose their jobs, right? Yeah. And so for me, that was this moment where I thought, well, I'm not sure that's political. They're not advocating for a political party. They're not saying, it wasn't a specifically sort of anti-president protest, right? It was quite in line with the messages that the school had been giving, right? If I see racist behavior, I'm going to do something about it. And that's what they were doing. And so it got me thinking about what work the word political did. And so I started to look throughout the school and sort of see when else this word was used. And I watched the principal use it when kids mounted a anti-gun violence protest, and they wanted to participate in a nationwide walkout. And he said, the schoolhouse is no place for politics, right? I saw it on the football page of the school, where and the football social media page said something like, we don't have any space for negativity here. Don't bring up race, religion, or gender. Like, just don't bring up those topics, right? Because those things are all political. And I was like, well, really? Race, religion, and gender are political, right? And so what became increasingly clear is that by using the word political, what the school and the staff were doing, were saying that anything that addresses inequality is off limits, right? And that's where the sort of kindness discourse stops, right? Is that you can sort of solve things with kindness, but you can't solve inequality with kindness. So the kind of racism they're okay with talking about is the kind where people are individually mean to one another, because that can be solved by kindness. But when we're talking about systemic racial inequality that's built into a social system, that can't be solved by kindness. And all of a sudden that becomes political. And so the school then curtails young people's ability to address these things, or teachers' ability to address these things, by calling them political and saying we can't deal with that during the school day. So the word political does really important work, and it signals the ends and the limits of what kindness can do.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the question that I think most academics always fear, which is, what do we do? What's the alternative if kindness isn't enough, if being nice isn't enough? what is a better response for schools and for us in general?
Right. I'm actually really happy you asked that, right? Because I thought a lot about what it meant to be a sociologist as I was writing this book, right? Because we're really, really good at pointing out problems.
Mhm.
And one thing I learned from the people at American, right, is that pointing out problems isn't enough, right? I was embedded with all of these people who really did want to make the world a better place. And so I would be doing them a disservice if I just walked in, pointed out problems, and didn't point out solutions. That's not okay to do, right? And in part, I was writing this book in some of the hardest days of the pandemic, right? So thinking about what we as sociologists could offer to help make this world a less horrifying place was really sort of on my heart at that particular time, right? As we were in this really horrifying moment. And so I began to read what people were writing about in the pandemic. And Greg Gonzalez and Amy Kopczynski wrote a piece about the politics of care, right?
Mm.
And what they say when they write about the politics of care is that they say that's the sort of thing we need to respond to a pandemic. We need to put human needs at the center of social policy, right? And so I began to think about what a politics of care would look like. And to me, a politics of care is systematizing care the way we systematize inequality, right? And so and I started to sort of think about what that might look like, right? So I said that the principal, for instance, told the students they couldn't have a school walkout because it would be considered political, right? And so a bunch of students went on this walkout anyway, and they risked failing final exams. They risked being marked with an unexcused absence, which could get them in a lot of trouble. And they were really sort of upset about it, right? And I looked around and saw what other schools did. There was another school that changed the bell schedule so students could go on a walkout without a penalty, right? So like really a really easy fix. Other schools put gun violence at the center of a bunch of assemblies and a whole educational, a whole set of curricular concerns, right? So that instead of saying, oh, we can't talk about this, it's political, they thought, oh, this is a time to learn about gun violence, right? Well, how can we sort of educate ourselves about gun violence and solutions to it, right? And so that's what I mean. That's sort of one of the things I think about when I think about systematizing care is building into the school, in this instance, as a social system, a way to address these topics, right? Rather than sort of leaving it to individual teachers, which I see happen a lot. Who risk their own jobs to do things like kneeling to protest racist police violence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Next, I want to get into kind of the nitty-gritty details of your methods. And so I have a question on behalf of the ethnographers and the audience, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about your data collection? One thing I've been thinking about is I'm sure in a high school, you have all sorts of interesting things happening simultaneously, and you can't be everywhere at once. So I'm curious how you decided where to be, when to be in X classroom instead of Y classroom, and kind of how you decided what to focus on and how you balanced considerations about depth versus breadth.
Oh, this is such a good question. I think one of the hardest things about being in a school is that there's so much happening at one time, right? And you have to pick, right? And so the first thing I did was to just station myself in the center of the school. And so fortunately for me, this particular school was organized around a student lounge, which is really sort of this giant interior courtyard. And in that lounge was where the main sort of safety officer of the school hung out. And Craig is his name. And so I hung out with him all the time. So he had this planter he would sit on the edge of, and he had this big table in front of him that had like flyers and crayons to color with, snacks that he paid for out of his own money. And now he wasn't the like school resource officer. He wasn't a cop, right? He was just like the safety guy who hung out there, made sure students got to class, but really spent a lot of time meeting student needs. He had nicknames for every student, right? He'd be sort of yelling out their nicknames as they walked past, and they'd roll their eyes like he was like dad telling them to get to class. It was great. So I hung out with Craig a lot, and that's how I got to meet the students, right? And he I think lent me an air of legitimacy. That wasn't just some like weird lady hanging out. Like
Friends of Craig.
So I was friends with Craig, so it's gonna be okay. And from there, I kind of let the students guide me, right?
Mhm.
They would be like, CJ, you got to come to human sexuality. The teacher the teacher keeps messing up non-monogamy and polygamy. You got to come. Like, all right, I'll go. Right. And so often the students would be the ones grabbing me and taking
Yeah.
me to the class. And that's my general approach. It's like, what are the kids interested in? And let me follow them around. And so that's why I ended up in the particular classes I ended up in. Sometimes it's because like, oh, they're talking about these topics and you're gonna love her. Oh, you're not gonna believe this teacher is doing crazy stuff. Or, oh, this is my favorite class. You gotta come here, right? And so get just this real range from them. And usually teachers like, sure, come on in, right? There weren't usually teachers who wouldn't sort of let me be a part of their classroom. Often because I sort of offered, I was like, I'm happy to talk about U of O, whatever. Like, let me know.
Yeah.
And they just like having another adult around, right? So it's lonely to be a teacher. And so the spots I studied sort of chose me, right? I didn't necessarily choose them, or I followed the kids around. And I always try to choose depth over breadth. And I think that's very important with ethnography, right? Because I think it often looks like we're seeing one thing, and until we see that thing 9 billion times from a bunch of different angles, we can't really be sure we're seeing it, actually. Something else might actually be happening. And so that's why I constantly look for depth rather than getting a little bit from everywhere, because I don't trust a little bit from everywhere. And I know that's not everybody's take, but that's mine. So
yeah. I'm curious whether you can think of now, maybe one of the things that you didn't end up following or that didn't end up making it into the book, something that you think deserves more attention, maybe in other research.
Oh, wow. Something that didn't, oh, there's so much that didn't make it into the book, actually. I would say what didn't make it into the book and what I think is going to be the next book is the sort of normative construction of sexuality in a school, even when let's see, even when the school is sort of this open and accepting place, right? That the schools can have a sort of inclusive sex ed curriculum officially, and it still produces a really, really normative line around sexuality. And I saw that happen multiple times at American High. That things would just be considered too sexy, and so they couldn't be a part of the school curriculum or a part of a school event, right? And of course, the too sexy things always had to do with LGBTQ youth. And nothing that the straight kids did was ever too sexy, right? And so to me, that was sort of there are these moments of sort of the way sort of sexual normativity was produced, right? Even in an inclusive environment, that I think is worthy of more study, that I didn't have quite enough of here to make claims about, right? But it was definitely suggestive. And so I think that's what I'm going to sort of delve into in the next book. So we'll see.
All right, I'll circle back in like 2029 to talk about that one.
I can move a little bit faster this time now that the kids are older. There's hopefully won't be another sort of situation like the one we've been through the past couple of years. So hopefully I'll move a little faster. So
fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm gonna dip my toe outside the scope of your book for a minute. And I've got a question about this other article that you've published with Sarah Diefendorf. So it's in Social Problems, and you're drawing some parallels between the school that you describe in this book and then a conservative evangelical megachurch. And so to me, at least, I think this seems like somewhat of an unlikely pairing. And so I'd love for you to tell us more about what's the thing that these places have in common, and what lessons did you take away from the comparison?
Thank you so much for asking about that. So all right, so my frequent co-author, Sarah Diefendorf, and I we were on the plane to ASA New York in 2019, and she was in the middle of writing her book, The Holy Vote, about this evangelical megachurch. And I had sort of just left the field and was just kind of working through, like, what did I see? What am I doing here? And we were just chatting about what things we had seen in our field sites. And it was mostly me chatting, trying to just process, right, these hundreds of pages of notes I had and memos and all these things. And I was talking a lot about this particular moment when the young folks I was studying had put on a Black Lives Matter display, and they had fought for years to put on this Black Lives Matter display, and the school kept saying, oh, young people aren't prepared for it, oh, it's anti-police, it's too political, right? And so finally these kids, along with some adult allies in the school, got this Black Lives Matter display up. And one of the parts of this display, so there are these huge trifold posters that listed out the image and name and story of a Black American who had been the victim of racist police violence. And then in the front of these tributes and these memorials were tables covered in butcher paper where students could react. And so many students reacted by sort of, demanding racial equity, demanding the laws change, et cetera, but about half the comments were ones like, can't we just all love one another, right? Or we need to be kind, right? And so there are these requests for love and kindness, as if that could solve systemic racist police violence. And so I was talking about this, and Sarah looks at me and is like, that's the way people at the church I study talk about racism. They talk about love. And I was like, and so we both sort of wondered, well, do we have something here? So both of us went back to our data. Pulled out only our observational data. We left our interviews out because those are just too different. Pulled out our all of our observational codes about love and race, and found that at both this very white evangelical, white conservative evangelical megachurch and a mostly white, very liberal school, we had a very similar discourse around racial inequality, which it was one of love, and that how love could solve racism, which took us really to Bonilla Silva's claims about racialized emotions, right? And he makes this argument that we think about racialized emotions as negative ones, right? That we think of them as being cruel or hatred. And he's like, yeah, but that's not true. There's actually positive racial or racialized emotions that seem positive but do really awful things. And so the article theorizes the way that love becomes this sort of racialized emotion, a sort of white racialized emotion by which racial inequality is upheld, right? So white people or in white organizations individualize racial inequality rather than seeing as systemic, by saying it's a problem of love and a lack of love. And if we just had more love, it would solve the problem of racial inequality and racism. So thank you for asking about that. It was delightful to sort of have that overlap and to sort of think about the way that whiteness sort of transcends political and white supremacy sort of transcends these political environments. So yeah, hope it's useful to folks. Yeah.
All right, then my very last question for you is just to wrap up, what message do you hope readers will take away from this book?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. And I'm hoping I think that I have two different sets of messages, right? Because it's a book that I think is read both sort of in and out of the academy. If Dude is any indication, this one will be similar. And I'm hoping that for those of us who are maybe not sociologists, that it shows the way that the importance of looking at social problems as systemic and not just individual, right? And provides folks with a set of or with a language sort of push back against kindness as a solution, right? Which again sounds sort of counterintuitive. Who's going to be against kindness? And so I hope this book can help unpack the limits of kindness, right? And so that's one thing that I hope folks take away. And then more within the academy, for those of us who are sociologists and are already primed to think about these problems as systemic, I hope that this book shows sort of a mechanism, because that's what we tend to be very interested in, a mechanism by which systemic social problems come to look like individual ones, right? That's what I want sociologists to sort of, or what I hope is helpful, right? We're often sort of bashing our heads against the wall, being like, no, but this is a systemic problem. And so I think the problem for us is to show how systemic problems appear to be individual, right? Such that it's hard for people to understand us, right? And so I hope that by unpacking these very micro level ways that these institutional and systemic problems look like individual problems, that can be helpful for us in helping to solve social problems. Yeah.
Well, thank you, CJ. Those are all the questions that we have for you today. And I hope that everyone in the audience will pick up a copy. Ooh, it doesn't recognize it.
That's so great. That's so good.
I promise there's a whole lot more gold that we didn't cover in this interview.
Well,
all right,
thank
bye,
you.
CJ. Thank you.
Thank you.